Hi everyone, welcome back. This video is about the changes that have taken place in farming in rural landscapes in MEDCs. An MEDC is a more economically developed country, such as, for example, our country, Scotland. Now, in this part of this unit, what you're being asked to do is to describe and explain the ways in which farming has developed and changed. So we're looking for a recent example of changes that have taken place in the industry of farming in our rural areas. So these break down into various subcategories, and the first I'm going to deal with is technology and technological change. As usual, if you see notes with an orange background, those should be copied. Pause the video at any time to give yourself time to keep up. You might be surprised by how technologically advanced farming has become in the last decades. For example, drone farming. As you can see in the picture, you know what a drone is, I assume. This allows the identification of areas in fields which are suffering from a lack of water, or perhaps are suffering from an outbreak of a particular disease, and it allows for the targeted release of chemicals. That, of course, means there's less chemical pollution going into the landscape, but also it saves the farmer money because they can strategically target where they want to spray those chemicals. Polytunnels are a frequent feature of our farming landscape these days, and what they do is they trap the heat. And even in Scotland, we're able to produce soft summer fruits much later into the year because of polytunnels. It means that they protect crops even in colder climates. Irrigation is the word we use for describing the process by which a farmer would direct water to where it is needed, sometimes through a system of pipes, using pumps to transfer the water from A to B. This means that the farmer doesn't just use water inefficiently, because sometimes water can be in short supply even in our own country. Computer-controlled irrigation systems are an increasingly frequent feature of farming. And as you can see in the diagram, a computer controls a series of pumps to direct the water to the field or even the area of the field where the water is required. This is more efficient and it makes sure that fewer crops are lost. This is a good picture of the inside of a modern combine. And you can see that it is not simply a gear stick and a steering wheel. They're really complex high-tech machines, and they use GPS technology. That's a global positioning technology using a satellite to make sure that the combine stays on course in the fields, because they have to go in very regular straight lines, and to make sure that they're getting maximum efficiency for how they are clearing the area of space of its yield of crops. This picture here, I think, summarizes it really nicely. This little gadget, you can see, actually shows the farmer the contours of the landscape and allows them to follow those contour lines. This means that the machine that they are driving neither goes uphill nor downhill, because a contour line is always at the same height. And it also allows them to plow or to sow seeds along those lines as well, which is a good way of reducing the impact of surface runoff washing the soil away. You can see in this picture these machines, the combine of the kind of one that you're looking at there, those are £1 million plus machines, or they can be. They're really, really serious pieces of technology, and they make farming hugely quicker and more efficient. And in so doing, they decrease labor costs. So the upfront cost of buying the equipment is very, very high. And most farmers actually rent their equipment off somebody whose business it is to own and maintain the machinery, and then they rent it out to the farmers. But this machinery makes it a lot faster, a lot more efficient, much less crop is lost because of using machinery, And of course, it means you don't have to have humans to do the work for you, which greatly reduces your labor costs. So, in the exam, you'll be asked to talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of changes in technology in farming in a rich country like Scotland. So here are the advantages of new technology. And what you want to do is you want to just make sure you've got those copied, as those are if you put those together, that is a model answer, basically, for how the advantages of new technology in farming. And you'll see that those pictures I've shown you and the notes you've taken there relate to the model answer that's on the screen in front of you. So pause the video and take a copy of that. New technology does have disadvantages as well, and it's important that you can talk about disadvantages because the question may specifically ask you to refer to advantages and disadvantages. So don't forget to learn some of these disadvantages. Technology can increase the amount of air pollution from the machinery. The cost of the equipment is very expensive. Farmers can become unemployed because of people who've replaced them with machines. And that can lead to rural areas becoming emptied of people because there's no reason for people to live in them. And that can destroy the culture of rural villages and communities. Using too many chemicals can damage ponds and lochs and riverways. It can cause a process called eutrophication, whereby the level of oxygen available for fish to breathe is reduced to a toxic level, and it can really cause significant harm to ecosystems. If you look back through the photos, you might see that there's very few hedgerows in a modern farm. That's because they are often removed in order to increase the field size to accommodate the large machinery. But in so doing, you destroy a vital animal habitat as lots of animals shelter within those hedgerows in order to survive. Okay, before we move on, it would be a good moment for you to pause this video and to replay the advantages and the disadvantages section of technology. There's a lot of detail in there. You need to make sure you've got them all written down and that they all made sense to you. So let's look at the next change. Diversification. Diversification is when you use the land for something else. There are reasons why farmers would do this. For example, farmers might want another way of making profit. Or alternatively, a farmer might want another way of making money so they don't only rely upon, for example, their sheep. Because what happens if their sheep have a disease one year and that kills all of the sheep, then the farmer's got no means of making money that year. And that's a really serious situation. Imagine if your family suddenly had no way of making money for an entire year. So diversification is a way of guaranteeing against crop failure, but it's also a way of increasing the number of ways that you can make profit from land. It also allows the farmer to make profit from land that's less usable, so less good quality land. So a farmer can use wind turbines for energy production. Another example would be they can use parts of their farmland for leisure and tourism, for example, this golf course. Another example would be to sell some of their own products via a farm shop. That means that they can make more profit because they don't have to go through a middleman by selling the product to someone else who then sells it in their shop. Old farm buildings, previously of course where the farm workers would have lived, but since we use machines those farm workers are no longer employed, those old buildings can be renovated and upgraded to make really attractive holiday homes for tourists. So, again, we need to know the advantages and the disadvantages. As I mentioned, Diversification helps boost farmers' incomes. You would need an example, such as a farm shop. This means farmers become more independent and less reliant on a subsidy. A subsidy is when the government helps farmers out by giving them money to support their businesses. Tourists visiting farms is a good thing because it helps people understand the rural landscape and it helps them experience it, as lots of people don't have many opportunities to do that. The farmer makes an income from non-farming activities. This is an important point because it means that, of course, the farmer isn't reliant upon one type of crop or one thing to get their money for that year, so they can afford to have a poor harvest. Some disadvantages. If you're encouraging tourists to come to your area, you're actually increasing the level of traffic congestion and air pollution. As a result of that, walls get damaged by people climbing over them, and footpath erosion damages the landscape. Increased litter can spoil the landscape, but also livestock can eat it and choke on it, and that can cause them to die. Tourist facilities, for example, campsites, actually can be quite ugly and can destroy the natural look of the countryside. If you're a farmer and you've got a river or a lake on your land, that can actually cause those rivers and lakes to become polluted by people using them for water sports. So you can see that there's a number of disadvantages. Some of those disadvantages might be triggering a memory for you from the conflicts section of this unit, and that's right that should be happening. You need to have remembered a balance of the advantages and the disadvantages for diversification. Okay, the next major area that farming has changed in Britain is in government policy. What do we mean by government policy? Well, the government gives money so farmers can rewild areas or plant more trees to offset carbon emissions. You may know that our government is trying to reduce the amount of CO2 we release into the atmosphere. One way of doing that is by planting more forests. And clearly, farmland is going to be an area that's open to that kind of initiative. Another area where you can that government policy is having an impact is you can see here the government has made funding available for financial support following the coronavirus outbreak, and that's a good up-to-date example of how the government supports, for example, in this case, dairy farmers. The government have rules, and some of those rules control the use of chemicals and the way and the times that those chemicals are used. And that's really important because if we don't have rules surrounding how we should be maintaining our fields of crops, then that can lead to disease setting into those crops, such as potato blight. And once that sets into a field, you can actually lose the whole field of potatoes. That may not sound like a big deal to you, but that's probably because you're not a farmer. If you lose an entire crop, that's a significant economic hit to your year's takings. Government policies are also in place to protect animal welfare. You can see a couple of examples of that in this picture. Obviously, this sheep is being given treatment to deal with perhaps an antibiotic. But also you can see that the sheep has a passport. That's a tag that's punched through the sheep's ear. And all livestock must have that passport in order to be legally sold and traded. And that's to avoid either poor quality meat entering the human food chain or animals that are ill and shouldn't be allowed to be in the kind of the breeding cycle. Those animals can be eliminated because they wouldn't have their passport. So again, we need the advantages and disadvantages of government policy. So here we go. In the UK, DEFRA, which is the Department for Food and Rural Affairs, or, if you prefer, the Scottish Rural Development Programme, the SRDP, supports the farming industry by providing subsidies. It doesn't matter which of these you remember, DEFRA or the SRDP, but you just do need to remember one of them, and that they provide subsidies. A subsidy is when the government gives money support to a farmer to help their business survive. The previous example of the £10,000 being offered to farmers to support their dairy farms in the coronavirus epidemic is an excellent example. DEFRA regulates policies which improve animal health and welfare regulations. For example, the passport tag that has to happen for every animal that's sold into the food chain. The government demands that disease control is done in plants and animals to maintain high standards of produce. I showed you pictures of potato blight a moment ago. You wouldn't want those potatoes going into your crisps. The government funds and supports research into agriculture, which in turn improves farming practices. Now, this last point, the Common Agricultural Policy, this was part of the European Union's legislation. Because we're obviously at a time of transition with that, because of Brexit, this answer may change. So I have phrased it as farmers used to set aside land to prevent the overproduction of certain crops. What that means is a farmer would deliberately not use part of their land in order for the amount of crops produced to be controlled. Because if you produce too many crops, the amount of money that you'll make will go down. And as I mentioned, there is money available from the government to make environmental improvements, such as tree planting. The disadvantages of government policy? Well, it's at this point in time unclear what impact Brexit will have on the UK farming industry. They could lose some of their EU funding grants or face reductions in the subsidies that they'll get because we're no longer part of the Common Agricultural Policy. Farmers can become dependent on government funding to keep their businesses going. Again, think about the money on offer to farmers in the coronavirus pandemic. Quotas placed on fishing or other produce can cause wastage. What this means is that a quota is a limit, a legal limit set on the amount of something that you're allowed to produce. So a great example is in the fishing industry. So if you catch a net full of fish and you're only allowed to catch cod in that net, but your net catches other fish alongside the cod, then you have to chuck all the fish that are not cod away because your quota is only for catching cod. This is actually intended to reduce overfishing because you'll only focus on the fish that you want to catch, but actually what it can result in is excess wastage because we throw fish that we would otherwise be able to eat back into the sea. Okay, the next area of change is organic farming, and we're nearly there, guys. There's a lot of notes for this section. What is organic farming? Basically, organic farming is when we do not use genetic engineering and we don't use synthetic pesticides or fertilizers to encourage plants to grow. We grow them naturally. Now, the advantages of organic farming are that they are chemical free, and that meets a change in our consumer demands. People these days want chemical-free food. A result of that is that we have decreased water pollution because we're no longer spraying chemicals on our crops, and that's good. It protects wildlife that live in areas of water, like lakes and streams. Organic produce often sells for a higher price, potentially giving the farmer a larger income. However, It also is difficult for the farmer to produce a very large yield because more of the crops will die from disease, and that can affect that. So disadvantages of organic farming: it's more labor intensive. It takes the farmer more time and more effort to grow the crops, and of course that can have an impact upon their profits. You can't just set up an organic farm just like that overnight. You need to have your organic farm status approved by the government, and that can take time, which can negatively affect a farmer's income at first. And as I've mentioned, because you're not using pesticides, that means that your crops are likely to die from natural diseases, and that can really affect you if you get a crop failure. And finally, the final change that we're going to focus on is genetic modification. What is genetic modification? Well, you can pause the video and read this infographic, but basically it's when we adapt or alter the DNA of a crop in order to give it different qualities. Qualities that help it survive, or qualities that help it fight disease, or qualities that help it increase its yields. A yield, remember, is the amount of crop that we're producing. Right. You need to know the advantages and the disadvantages of genetic modification. So here they are. Genetically modified crops can increase crop yields and improve resistance to disease. More tolerant crop varieties can be grown where they couldn't previously be grown. So you can develop crops that require less water, for example. And they reduce the needs for pesticides. That's because some GM crops are actually able to kill pests that try and eat them. Some disadvantages are that many people disagree with the use of GM crops, saying that they have a negative impact on the environment. For example, if you create a genetically altered tomato, that tomato could then breed with natural tomatoes, and you would end up with a mixing of those two types of plant, and we don't know where that process would end. Once it's out there in nature, we can't control it. And there are some health concerns around the use of GM seeds, and therefore some people believe they shouldn't be used by farmers, but that is a matter of opinion. And we're here. If you've made it through this video, you've done very well, guys, because this is quite a dense area of the course. If you're being asked to explain the advantages and disadvantages of recent developments in farming in areas such as the UK, then look at the picture, because you would be asked to not only say the good things and the bad things, but you'd be asked to choose from some of the things that the exam has provided. So for example, if it were me, I would choose new technology because it's one of the ones that's got the most notes attached to it, and therefore it's easiest to remember the advantages and disadvantages of new technology. Genetic modification and organic farming have less to say about them, and therefore maybe you want to make a strategic choice about where you want to focus your revision. Diversification and current government policy are, I would say, more important examples of changes that you might want to focus on. And I know it's possibly the one that maybe interests you the least, but the current government policy one is certainly the most relevant. So if it were me and I was studying for my exam, I would be revising new technology and current government policy the most, making sure I know at least 2 or 3 advantages and disadvantages for each, and then having a more superficial knowledge and understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of diversification, organic farming, and genetic modification. Right. We're going to look at farming in LEDCs and the changes that take place there in next video, and that'll be the last video of the farming unit.